My name is Jasmine. I am 35 years old, and today I walked into a mahogany paneled conference room to bury my uncle. My mother, Patricia, took one look at me and told the room I was a runaway who did not deserve a dime of her brother's money. I simply took a sip of my sparkling water and reminded her that I did not run away. She packed my belongings in a garbage bag and left me on his porch when I was 12 years old. She had no idea the lawyer walking through the doors was about to hand me the keys to a $15 million empire and leave her with nothing but bus fare. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned the pain of family rejection into your ultimate power. The air conditioning in the offices of Sterling and Associates was turned up high enough to freeze a person, but it did nothing to cool the suffocating tension in the room. I sat perfectly still in my tailored emerald green suit, watching my biological family unravel before the estate reading even began. Patricia, the woman who gave birth to me, sat across the massive oak table. The heavy scent of her gardenia perfume practically choked the room, battling with the sharp smell of polished wood and expensive leather. She was dripping in fake pearls, wearing a loud floral dress that screamed for attention. It was completely inappropriate for a legal proceeding involving her late brother's estate, but Patricia always needed to be the center of gravity in any room she entered, regardless of the occasion. Next to her sat my older sister, Kendra. She was the undisputed golden child of our family, the one whose mistakes were always erased, and whose mediocre achievements were celebrated like Olympic victories. Kendra had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, wearing an expression of permanent distaste that matched our mother's perfectly. And hovering right behind Kendra was her husband, Trevor. Trevor was a corporate vice president at Apex Hospitality, a fact he managed to slide into every conversation within 5 minutes of meeting someone. As a white man who had married into our family, he carried an infuriatingly smug demeanor, acting as if his presence alone elevated our social standing. He loudly tapped the face of his oversized Rolex, sighing heavily to let everyone know his time was far too valuable to be spent in a waiting room with me. Next to Patricia sat my father, Roland. He stared blankly at his phone, choosing silence over intervention, just as he had done my entire life. His passive complicity was a quiet violence that had hurt me just as much as my mother's open hostility. I had not spoken to any of them in over 2 decades. The last time I saw Patricia, she was pulling her sedan out of Uncle Desmond's driveway, not even looking back in the rearview mirror as I stood on the porch holding a black plastic trash bag filled with my entire life. But today, Uncle Desmond was gone. He was the only man who had ever truly shown me unconditional love. He took in a discarded 12-year-old and raised her into a formidable woman. He taught me about real estate, about business, and about self-worth. He had passed away from a sudden stroke just weeks prior, leaving a massive hole in my heart. I was sitting at this table to honor his legacy while they were clearly here to collect a payout they felt deeply entitled to. Patricia slammed her manicured hand flat against the glossy table. Her acrylic nails made a sharp clacking sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. She glared at me, her eyes narrowing with a familiar toxic resentment that I remembered so vividly from my childhood. "Why is she even allowed in the building?" Patricia demanded, addressing the empty room since the lawyer had not yet arrived. Desmond was my brother, my blood. He would not leave a single dime to a runaway who turned her back on her own parents just to live a rebellious lifestyle. Kendra scoffed loudly in agreement, adjusting her designer knockoff handbag on her lap. "Seriously," Jasmine, Kendra added, rolling her eyes. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here. Uncle Desmond was family, and you checked out of this family a long time ago. We all know you are just here sniffing around for a handout because your little startup ventures probably went under and you need us to bail you out." Trevor leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table with a condescending chuckle. "Look, Jasmine, let us be adults here," Trevor said, using his practiced corporate boardroom voice. "We understand you probably need the cash, but estate law is complicated. My legal team deals with this kind of thing all the time. When someone runs away from their legal guardians, their standing in probate court is practically non-existent. You are wasting your afternoon, and you are wasting ours. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my leather chair, picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold liquid grounded me. I set the glass down silently on a coaster and looked directly into Patricia's eyes, watching the familiar hostility burning behind them. "I did not run away, Patricia," I said, my voice steady, carrying a quiet authority that instantly commanded the room. "I did not run away, and you know it. You packed my clothes in a hefty bag and left me on Uncle Desmond's porch in the middle of a thunderstorm when I was 12 years old. You abandoned me because you needed my college savings to pay for Kendra's debutante pageants and vocal lessons." Patricia's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. She opened her mouth to argue, but I did not let her speak. I held my hand up slightly, cutting her off with a motion so swift it left her speechless for a fraction of a second. "Uncle Desmond took me in when you threw me away." I continued, holding her gaze without a drop of intimidation. "He put me through school. He taught me business. He treated me like a daughter while you were busy taking out second mortgages to fund Trevor's failing startup ideas and Kendra's luxury car leases. So do not sit across from me and talk about family loyalty. You are here for a payday. I am here for my uncle." "How dare you speak to your mother that way?" Patricia shrieked, half rising from her chair, her fake pearls rattling against the table. "I gave you life. You owe me respect. I am his sister. Half of everything he owned belongs to me by right, and I will make sure the judge knows exactly what kind of manipulative, ungrateful child you really are." Trevor scoffed again, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. "Let her talk, Patricia," Trevor said, crossing his arms and leaning back. "It does not matter what she says. There is absolutely no way a high school dropout manages to inherit a $15 million estate over immediate law-abiding blood relatives. My lawyers will have any claim she makes contested and frozen by noon today. You will be lucky to walk away with a bus pass, Jasmine." I just smiled. A slow, chilling smile that made Kendra shift uncomfortably in her seat. I pulled a sleek, encrypted tablet from my Prada tote bag and tapped the screen a few times. I slid it across the smooth oak table directly toward Trevor, stopping perfectly in front of his folded hands. "You are a vice president at Apex Hospitality, right, Trevor?" I asked, my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "You might want to check your corporate inbox. Or better yet, look at the screen right in front of you." Trevor frowned, looking down at the tablet. Kendra leaned over his shoulder, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this supposed to prove?" Kendra muttered, her voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge as her eyes scanned the complex financial documents displayed on the high-definition screen. "You might want to check who just bought a 60% majority stake in your parent company this morning," I said, leaning forward slightly, letting my words sink in with surgical precision. Spoiler alert, Trevor. It was not Uncle Desmond. It was Lux Haven Resorts. My company. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. The color completely drained from Trevor's face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the harsh fluorescent lights. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted across the digital signatures, confirming his worst nightmare. Kendra looked from the tablet to her husband, clearly not understanding the magnitude of what she was looking at, but sensing the sudden violent shift in the room's power dynamic. Patricia, oblivious to the corporate execution that had just occurred right next to her, continued her loud complaining. "I do not care about your little hospitality business," Patricia yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "We are talking about Desmond's money, real estate. You are nothing but a stray he took pity on." Just as Patricia reached the peak of her rant, the heavy oak doors at the end of the conference room swung open. The room went dead silent. Elias Sterling, the senior estate lawyer and Uncle Desmond's oldest friend, walked in. He was a tall, imposing man in a tailored charcoal suit, clutching a thick, sealed red folder against his chest. His expression was grim, his eyes scanning the room and taking in the hostility radiating from my parents' side of the table. He offered me a brief, respectful nod, which Patricia completely missed. Sterling walked to the head of the table, placed the heavy red folder down, and adjusted his reading glasses. He looked directly at Patricia, then at Roland, who had remained cowardly silent the entire time, and finally at Trevor, who was still staring at my tablet, as if it were a live grenade. "Let us get this over with," Sterling said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice brooked no arguments and held absolutely no warmth for my biological family. "Settle down and take your seats. You are all going to want to hear this." Elias Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and broke the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. He pulled a silver letter opener from his breast pocket and sliced through the thick red wax seal of the folder. Across the massive mahogany table, Patricia straightened her posture. She smoothed down the loud floral fabric of her dress and shot a triumphant glance at my father Roland. Roland practically leaned over the table, his eyes locked on the documents, like a starving man staring at a meal he believed he was finally about to consume. He had spent the previous 20 minutes complaining loudly about the valet parking and the temperature of the building, but now he was perfectly quiet. The heavy scent of Patricia's gardenia perfume seemed to thicken in the cold, conditioned air as she nudged Kendra. My perfect sister flipped her expensive hair extensions over her shoulder and gripped Trevor's arm. I could hear her whispering to him about which of Uncle Desmond's downtown Atlanta properties they were going to renovate first, and which ones they would sell for quick cash. They were all mentally dividing and spending money that had not even been distributed yet. Sterling cleared his throat and began reading the standard legal preamble. I kept my face entirely neutral, taking another slow sip of my sparkling water. Uncle Desmond had built a $15 million hospitality empire from a single rundown motel he bought back in the early 90s. He worked 70-hour weeks, managed his staff with respect, and invested every spare dollar back into his business. Roland and Patricia, on the other hand, had spent their adult lives bouncing from one failed get-rich-quick scheme to another, always looking for a shortcut. Sterling read through a few minor charitable donations first. $500,000 to the local youth center where Desmond used to volunteer, $200,000 to his favorite community outreach program. With every sum announced, Patricia's jaw tightened visibly. She tapped her manicured nails aggressively against the polished wood, clearly annoyed that her brother was giving away her perceived inheritance to complete strangers. Finally, Sterling turned the page. He looked directly at Patricia before looking back down at the document. This specific clause was written in Desmond's own words. Sterling took a deep breath and read clearly. "To my sister Patricia, I leave the sum of $10,000. Patricia gasped, a wide, greedy smile breaking across her face. She turned to Roland, clapping her hands together. "That is just the cash advance. Wait until he lists the properties and the investment portfolios. We are going to buy that house in Alpharetta today." Sterling held up a hand, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. "Allow me to finish, Patricia." The document continues. "I leave the sum of $10,000 exactly to cover the cost of the gas money it took for you to drive your 12-year-old daughter to my house and abandon her on my porch 23 years ago. I consider that debt paid in full. You will receive nothing else from this estate, not a single property, not a single share of stock." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning vent above us and the distant traffic from the Atlanta streets below. Patricia's fake pearls seemed to clatter against her chest as she stopped breathing entirely. Roland's face turned the color of a bruised plum, the veins in his neck bulging against his tight collar. Sterling did not wait for them to recover from the shock. He flipped to the final page. "As for the remainder of my estate, including all liquid assets, the Buckhead Mansion, and total ownership of the Desmond Hospitality Group, I leave entirely to my niece Jasmine. She is the only one in this family who knows the value of hard work and the only one who actually stayed by my side when I was sick." Chaos erupted. It was not a slow build. It was an immediate, violent explosion of pure entitlement. Roland jumped out of his chair so fast it tipped over backwards and crashed heavily against the hardwood floor. He slammed both his fists onto the mahogany table, sending a shockwave through the room. "This is a sick joke!" Roland shouted, his voice cracking with rage. Desmond was out of his mind. He was completely senile at the end. "You manipulated him, Jasmine. You spent the last 20 years isolating him and poisoning him against his own blood." I set my glass down silently. I looked Roland directly in the eyes, refusing to back down from his aggressive posturing. I poisoned him. I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Roland, you did not even call Desmond when he had his first heart attack 5 years ago. You were too busy taking out a third mortgage on your house to pay for Kendra's destination wedding in Tulum. You chose your golden child. Desmond chose me. Patricia was on her feet now, her face contorted into a mask of pure fury. She pointed a trembling finger right at my face, her voice pitching into a hysterical shriek. You ungrateful little brat. I am his sister. Half of everything he built belongs to me by right of blood. We are going to sue you. We are going to drag you through probate court until you do not have a single penny left to your name. You think you can just swoop in here and steal my brother's legacy? I rested my hands on the table, feeling the cool polish beneath my fingertips. Your brother's legacy was built on early mornings and late nights, Patricia. Your legacy is bouncing checks, unpaid credit card bills, and a daughter you threw away like trash because she cost too much to feed. I earned my place at Desmond's side. You earned your $10,000 gas reimbursement. Be smart and take the money before I decide to challenge that small payout too. Kendra started crying. They were perfect rehearsed tears meant to garner immediate sympathy. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly. Trevor immediately put his arm around her, puffing out his chest as he stepped up to the edge of the table. Trevor always loved playing the white savior for my family. He thrived on the dynamic, treating my parents like charity cases he could manage with a few condescending smiles and a flash of his corporate badge. Trevor laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that cut through Patricia's screaming and Roland's heavy breathing. He looked down at me as if I were a stain on the expensive carpet. Let us bring this back to reality, Jasmine, Trevor said, using his practiced boardroom voice dripping with unearned superiority. I am a vice president at Apex Hospitality. I deal with corporate acquisitions, massive asset transfers, and complex estate law on a daily basis. My legal team will have this entire will contested and frozen by noon today. He leaned across the table, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. There is absolutely no way a high school dropout who barely knows how to balance a checkbook is legally or functionally capable of managing a $15 million hospitality estate over her immediate law-abiding blood relatives. We will tie this up in court for a decade if we have to. We will freeze every single asset, every bank account, and every property deed. By the time my lawyers are done draining your resources, you will be begging us for a settlement. You will be lucky to walk away from this table with a bus pass. Trevor smirked, completely satisfied with his own threat. He stood up straight and adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking at Elias Sterling, as if expecting the seasoned lawyer to immediately fold under his corporate weight and hand over the documents. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his aggressive, chaotic energy. I simply reached into my Prada tote bag and pulled out a sleek, encrypted tablet. I tapped the screen, waking it up, and pulled up a specific, highly confidential digital document that my own legal team had finalized just an hour before this meeting. I slid the tablet across the smooth surface of the oak table. It glided perfectly and stopped right in front of Trevor's folded hands, illuminating his face with the bright white light of the screen. You are a vice president at Apex Hospitality, right, Trevor? I asked, my tone light and conversational, as if we were discussing where to get lunch instead of dismantling his entire life. Trevor frowned, looking down at the screen. His smug expression began to slip. Check your inbox, Trevor. I continued, holding his gaze with absolute, unwavering authority. Trevor stared at the glowing screen of the tablet. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint, ragged sound of his breathing. His eyes darted back and forth across the digital document, tracking the corporate letterhead of Apex Hospitality. It was an internal memo distributed to the executive board just moments before this meeting began. I watched the arrogant color drain entirely from his face, replaced by a sickly pale shade of panic. His hands, the same hands that had confidently tapped that expensive Rolex minutes earlier, began to tremble. This is a fake! Trevor stammered, his voice stripped of all its previous corporate bravado. He pushed the tablet away as if it were burning his fingers. This is a forged document. You cannot simply orchestrate a corporate buyout of a global hospitality group without anyone knowing. It is legally impossible. I did not raise my voice, but I let a sharp, cold smile touch my lips. You might want to check who just bought a 60% majority stake in your parent company this morning, I said smoothly, leaning forward to rest my elbows on the mahogany table. Spoiler alert, Trevor. It was not Uncle Desmond. It was Lux Haven Resorts. My company. Trevor gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. No, my CEO would have told me. I am on the executive steering committee. We would have seen the filings. You really think I would use my own name for the initial acquisitions? I asked, tilting my head in mock sympathy. I spent the last 18 months quietly purchasing blocks of Apex stock through shell companies based in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. You and your board were too busy taking luxury retreats to notice the aggressive accumulation of your voting shares. By the time I consolidated the holding companies this morning, the hostile takeover was already complete. The board voted to accept my restructuring proposal exactly 1 hour ago. I own your company, Trevor. I own the desk you sit at. I own the corporate jet you love to brag about. And as of today, I own your employment contract. Kendra snatched the tablet from the table, her eyes frantically scanning the complex legal jargon she clearly did not understand. Trevor, what is she talking about? Kendra demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. Tell her she is lying. Tell her we are going to sue her for defamation. Trevor could not even look at his wife. He stared blankly at the wood paneling, his entire identity collapsing in real time. That is enough. Patricia suddenly slammed both of her hands onto the table, standing up so violently her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her face twisted into a mask of maternal outrage. I will not sit here and let you disrespect your family. You are a bitter, jealous little girl. I am your mother. I gave you life. I carried you for 9 months, and this is how you repay me. By attacking your sister's husband with these ridiculous, fabricated lies. You demand respect from us, but you have no respect for the woman who brought you into this world. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound surgical clarity. You lost the right to demand my respect the day you drove away and left me standing in the rain. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. Even Elias Sterling, the seasoned estate lawyer, leaned back and watched the execution unfold. You did not raise me, Patricia. I continued, standing up slowly to match her level. Uncle Desmond raised me. He gave me a job sweeping the floors of his first motel. He taught me how to read balance sheets by the time I was 15. He co-signed the commercial loan for my first boutique hotel when I turned 21. I built Lux Haven Resorts from a single rundown property in Savannah into a global hospitality empire. I worked 90-hour weeks, slept in my office, and sacrificed everything to build my wealth. I walked slowly around the edge of the massive table, closing the distance between us. And what exactly were you doing during those 20 years, Patricia? I asked, locking eyes with her. Let us tell everyone the truth. Let us talk about how you funded Kendra's perfect lifestyle. Patricia swallowed hard, taking a slight step back. Her eyes darted nervously toward my father Roland, who was watching us with a sudden deep confusion. Keep your mouth shut, Jasmine. Patricia warned, her voice losing its fiery edge and dropping into a desperate hiss. I turned my attention to my father. Did you know Roland? I asked, watching his eyes widen. Did you know that while I was building a real legacy, your wife was secretly taking out a second mortgage on your family home? She drained your joint retirement accounts to pay for Kendra's lavish destination weddings, her designer wardrobes, and Trevor's pathetic tech startup that folded before it even launched an app. Roland's face turned completely gray. He looked at Patricia, his mouth hanging open. Patricia, tell me she is lying, Roland croaked, grasping the edge of the table for support. Tell me you did not mortgage the house. Patricia could not look at him. She stared at the floor, her fake pearls suddenly looking incredibly heavy around her neck. She cannot tell you that because the bank records do not lie. Roland, I stated mercilessly. Uncle Desmond knew everything. He watched you bleed your own family dry to support a daughter who refuses to work and a son-in-law who relies on a corporate title to hide his incompetence. Desmond left you $10,000 because he knew if he left you $1 million you would hand it straight to Kendra and be bankrupt within a year. He left his empire to me because he knew I would protect it. Kendra let out a loud, dramatic sob, burying her face in Trevor's shoulder. Trevor, however, was too paralyzed by his own impending ruin to comfort her. He was staring at his phone, which rested on the table in front of him. "You are a monster!" Kendra cried, peering at me through her fingers. "You planned all of this just to humiliate us." "I did not plan your financial incompetence, Kendra," I replied smoothly. "I simply secured my own future. You built your life on a foundation of lies and secret debt. I built mine on concrete. You are just upset because the concrete finally cracked your glass house." The suffocating tension in the room was suddenly shattered by a loud, obnoxious ringtone. It blared from Trevor's phone, echoing off the mahogany walls. Trevor jumped as if he had been physically struck. He stared at the caller ID, the blood draining from his face, all over again. The screen brightly displayed the name of the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Hospitality. Trevor's hands shook violently as he reached for the device. He fumbled with the screen, nearly dropping the phone before pressing it to his ear. He stepped away from the table, turning his back to us like a frightened child. Sir Trevor stammered into the receiver, his voice trembling with pure panic. "Sir, I can explain. The rumors about the buyout, I had no idea they were moving this fast. Please, sir, my position here is vital to the upcoming quarter." Even from across the room, I could hear the muffled shouting of the CEO on the other end of the line. The voice was furious, relentless, and absolute. Trevor shrunk into himself, his shoulders dropping, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for him. He nodded frantically, whispering apologies into the phone, while Kendra watched him in absolute horror. Her meal ticket, her status, her entire identity was evaporating right before her eyes. Elias Sterling cleared his throat. The sound was quiet, but it immediately commanded the room. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the final page of Uncle Desmond's thick red folder. He folded his hands together, resting them on top of the documents. He looked at Trevor pacing in the corner, then at Patricia, who was silently weeping, then finally at me. A faint glimmer of respect shined in the old lawyer's eyes. "There is one more stipulation regarding the Buckhead estate," Jasmine Sterling said, his voice cutting through the sounds of Trevor's desperate pleading. He looked directly at my parents, his expression turning remarkably cold. "And your parents are not going to like it." Elias Sterling did not even blink as Trevor fled the room in a blind panic. The veteran lawyer simply looked at my parents and delivered the final blow. The stipulation was crystal clear. Anyone who contested the will or attempted to unlawfully access any of Desmond's assets would immediately forfeit their inheritance, including Patricia's $10,000 insult, and face immediate prosecution for trespassing. They had stormed out of the office screaming about injustice and lawsuits. I thought that would be the end of it for at least a few months while their bargain basement lawyers tried to decipher Sterling's ironclad contracts. I underestimated their sheer delusional greed. 3 days later, I was sitting in my corner office in downtown Atlanta. The floor-to-ceiling windows of Lux Haven Resort's headquarters offered a sprawling view of the city I had conquered. I was reviewing expansion plans for our new properties in Europe when my intercom buzzed. It was not my executive assistant. It was Marcus, my head of private security. He stepped into my office, closing the heavy glass door behind him. His face was carved from stone, but I could see the rigid tension in his jaw. He informed me that the perimeter sensors at Uncle Desmond's Buckhead estate had been tripped. Patricia, Roland, and Kendra had actually hired a shady locksmith to drill through the heavy mahogany front doors. They had completely bypassed the secondary alarm system because Roland remembered the old override code Desmond used 5 years ago. When the neighborhood patrol car rolled up to check the initial sensor alert, Roland confidently handed the guard a printed document. It was a completely fabricated lease agreement. They were aggressively claiming squatter rights. They genuinely believed that physical possession of the property would somehow guarantee them ownership while they dragged out the probate process. I did not throw my coffee cup against the wall. I did not scream. I felt a glacial calm wash over my entire body. They were treating my uncle's sanctuary like a cheap motel they could just occupy. I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored suit, and looked at Marcus. I told him to pull the SUVs around and assemble the primary security detail. We were going for a ride. The drive to Buckhead took 20 minutes. I spent every second of it visualizing the layout of Desmond's estate. It was a sprawling classical mansion set back from the street, surrounded by ancient oak trees and manicured gardens. Desmond had bought it when his business first exploded, and it was the only place I had ever truly felt safe. Now it was being infected by the very people who had made my childhood a living nightmare. When my security caravan pulled up the sweeping circular driveway, I saw Patricia's scuffed sedan parked directly in front of the grand entrance, leaking oil onto the pristine cobblestones. They had not even bothered to close the massive double doors all the way. Their arrogance was so profound they honestly thought they had won. They thought they had outsmarted a billionaire and a team of elite estate lawyers by simply breaking a lock. I stepped out of my vehicle, flanked by Marcus and 3 heavily built security contractors dressed in sharp black suits. We walked up the marble steps and pushed the front doors wide open. The disrespect hit me before I even fully crossed the threshold. Loud, awful pop music was echoing through the grand foyer, bouncing off the imported Italian marble in the crystal chandelier. Suitcases, cheap duffel bags, and random cardboard boxes were thrown carelessly across Desmond's priceless Persian rugs. And then I heard the unmistakable sound of a cork popping, followed by loud, raucous laughter. I walked into the main living room. Patricia was sprawled out on Desmond's custom leather sofa, her shoes still on, resting right on top of a silk throw pillow. Roland was standing by the antique wet bar, holding a bottle of Desmond's prized vintage champagne. It was a bottle my uncle had explicitly saved for my wedding day. Roland poured the bubbling liquid into 3 crystal flutes, spilling it recklessly across the polished mahogany wood. They turned their heads when my security team stepped into the room, spreading out to block all the exit points. Patricia actually smiled a twisted, triumphant grin that stretched her face into something grotesque. She took a sip of the stolen champagne and crossed her legs, looking around the massive room as if she were taking inventory of her new kingdom. "Look who finally decided to come home!" Patricia sneered, her voice slurring slightly. "I hope you did not come to pack your things, Jasmine, because we have already claimed the master suite. Roland is taking Desmond's old office. You can have the guest house out back if you behave yourself. We are willing to be generous." I did not respond to her delusion. My eyes drifted upward, tracking the sound of footsteps on the landing. Kendra appeared at the top of the sweeping grand staircase. She was wearing a silk robe that I instantly recognized. It belonged to Desmond's late wife. The absolute violation of seeing my sister wearing that garment made my blood run ice cold. Kendra leaned casually against the ornate wrought iron banister, swirling the champagne in her glass. She looked down at me with a sickeningly smug expression, completely oblivious to the danger she was in. Trevor was not with them, clearly too terrified of my corporate reach to show his face, but he had definitely given them some terrible legal advice before he went into hiding. "Dad says we can tie you up in probate court for a decade," Kendra called out, her voice echoing down the staircase. "He talked to a lawyer friend of his this morning. Since we are immediate family and we have established physical residency, there is nothing you or your fancy lawyers can do to forcefully evict us without a lengthy court battle. We have squatter rights now, Jasmine. You might own the hotels, but we hold the keys to the castle, so we might as well make ourselves comfortable." Roland nodded, puffing his chest out as he took another large gulp of the vintage champagne. "That is right. The law protects family. You cannot just throw your own mother and father out on the street. We live here now. You are going to have to negotiate with us if you ever want to see the inside of this house again." They stood there radiating an unearned victory, completely convinced that their pathetic grasp of real estate law was going to magically undo a bulletproof $15 million trust. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought the little girl they threw away in a garbage bag was going to suddenly bend to their will just because they aggressively occupied a living room. I looked at Patricia lounging on the sofa. I looked at Roland holding the stolen bottle. I looked at Kendra wearing a dead woman's robe. I did not yell. I did not show them a single ounce of the rage burning in my chest. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at Marcus, who was standing at attention, waiting for my command. "Box up everything that does not belong to the estate," I said, my voice slicing through the room like a freshly sharpened blade. "If they resist, call the police." Marcus did not need to be told twice. He raised 2 fingers, and the 3 men in black suits moved with the terrifying efficiency of a highly trained military unit. They bypassed my seething parents entirely and went straight for the pathetic pile of luggage scattered across the imported rugs. One guard grabbed Roland's scuffed golf bag, while another hoisted the cardboard boxes they had dragged into the foyer. "Wait, just a minute!" Roland bellowed, lunging forward to grab the arm of the nearest guard. "You cannot touch our property. We have legal rights." The guard did not even break a sweat. He simply turned his shoulder, breaking Roland's weak grip with zero effort, and continued marching toward the front door. Roland stumbled backward, looking completely emasculated. Kendra shrieked from the top of the stairs, clutching the silk robe tightly around her waist. "You are stealing from us, Jasmine. Trevor is going to have you arrested for this." I looked up at her, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "Take off the robe, Kendra." She froze, her eyes wide with shock. "What did you say to me?" "I said take off the robe." I repeated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "That belonged to Aunt Eleanor. You have exactly 10 seconds to take it off and hand it to my security team, or I will have Marcus peel it off you himself and charge you with grand larceny." Kendra's face crumpled. She looked frantically at our parents for support, but Roland was too busy arguing with a guard over a cheap duffel bag. Trembling, Kendra slid the vintage silk off her shoulders, revealing the faded sweatpants and tank top she wore underneath. She dropped the robe over the banister like it was on fire. Marcus caught it, neatly folding it over his arm. That was the breaking point for Patricia. Seeing her golden child humiliated in front of hired help snapped whatever thin thread of sanity my mother was still holding on to. She hurled her crystal champagne flute at the marble floor. It shattered into 100 glittering pieces, sending expensive vintage champagne splashing across the polished stone. "You ungrateful, evil little wretch!" Patricia screamed, her voice vibrating with a hysterical, frantic energy. She marched toward me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, toxic rage. The heavy scent of her gardenia perfume hit me like a physical blow. "You come into this house and disrespect your own family. I gave you life. I carried you. I birthed you. You owe us respect. You owe us everything. You would be nothing without the life I gave you." Marcus stepped forward instantly, moving to position his massive frame between me and my mother, but I held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. I did not need protection from Patricia anymore. I had stopped being afraid of her the day she left me on a porch with my life stuffed in a garbage bag. I closed the distance between us. I stepped right into her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to look at me. I did not yell. I did not scream. I dropped my voice to a deadly whisper that carried more power than any shout ever could. "You gave me life." "Patricia?" I asked, the words slipping out like ice. "Let us talk about the life you gave me. You gave me chronic asthma from forcing me to sleep on a damp mattress in the unfinished basement while Kendra slept in the custom-painted master suite upstairs. You told the doctors I was just prone to sickness, but we both know it was the black mold growing on the concrete walls right next to my pillow." Patricia opened her mouth to deny it, but the sheer intensity in my eyes paralyzed her vocal cords. "You gave me an eating disorder." I continued, stepping even closer, forcing her to take a clumsy step backward. "You put combination padlocks on the pantry doors so I could not eat without your permission. You weighed the cereal boxes and counted the granola bars to make sure I was not stealing food while you bought Kendra takeout from expensive restaurants every single night. You taught me that hunger was a punishment for existing. You gave me nothing but trauma and a daily reminder that I was a burden to you." Roland had stopped arguing with the guards. The entire room was dead silent, save for the ragged sound of Patricia's breathing. "Uncle Desmond gave me a life," I said, my voice striking like a hammer. "He took the broken, malnourished girl you threw away, and he taught her how to stand up straight. He fed me. He clothed me. He loved me. This is his house, and you are desecrating it just by standing here. Get out. Patricia stood trembling, her fists clenched at her sides. She searched my face for any sign of the desperate people-pleasing daughter she used to manipulate, but she found absolutely nothing. There was no love left for her here. There was not even hate. There was only a formidable woman she could no longer control. Marcus, I said, not breaking eye contact with my mother, escort these trespassers off my property. My security team moved in. They flanked Patricia Rowland and a sobbing Kendra, firmly guiding them toward the open front doors. Rowland tried to shout something about calling his lawyer, but one stern look from Marcus silenced him instantly. They were herded out of the grand foyer and marched down the marble steps like common criminals. I followed them out, standing on the wide front porch as the warm Atlanta breeze swept over the lawn. The guards tossed their cheap luggage haphazardly onto the manicured grass right next to the driveway. Patricia was hyperventilating, clinging to Roland's arm, while Kendra wept dramatically into her hands. They looked pathetic, stripped of their arrogant delusions and forced out into the harsh daylight. I was just about to instruct Marcus to lock the gates behind them when the high-pitched whine of a luxury engine echoed through the neighborhood. A sleek black Porsche Panamera tore up the long winding driveway, taking the corner far too fast. The tires screeched against the cobblestones as the car slammed on its brakes, stopping inches from Patricia's leaking sedan. Kendra gasped, dropping her hands from her face. "Trevor," she cried out, taking a step toward the Porsche. "You came back for us." The driver's side door swung open. Trevor stepped out. But the man emerging from the vehicle was not the terrified, broken executive I had crushed in the boardroom 3 days ago. His tie was perfectly knotted. His posture was rigid. He did not look at his weeping wife or his humiliated in-laws. He looked directly past them, locking his eyes on me standing on the porch. He reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. He slammed the car door shut and marched up the driveway, waving the legal documents in the air like a weapon. He was not there to pick up his wife. He was there for war. The crunch of expensive high-performance tires gripping the cobblestone driveway shattered the tense silence of the front lawn. The sleek black Porsche Panamera practically skidded to a halt mere inches from Patricia's leaking and neglected sedan. The driver's side door swung open, and Trevor stepped out into the humid Atlanta air. He did not look like a man who had just been professionally obliterated 3 days prior. He was wearing a freshly pressed charcoal suit, his silk tie perfectly knotted, his hair impeccably styled. He looked like a corporate predator arriving for a hostile negotiation. He did not spare a single glance for his in-laws who were standing by their discarded luggage looking utterly pathetic. He did not even look at Kendra, who had gasped his name in desperate relief. Trevor's eyes were locked entirely on me. He reached into the passenger seat and retrieved a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. He slammed the car door shut and marched up the marble steps with aggressive, blinding purpose. He did not say a word as he reached the porch. He simply bypassed Marcus by a fraction of an inch and violently shoved the heavy stack of papers directly into my chest. I did not flinch. I let the documents fall away, hitting the porch with a loud thud that sent crisp white pages scattering across the stone. Marcus immediately took a step forward, his hand sliding smoothly inside his suit jacket, but I raised 2 fingers to halt him. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of delusion Trevor was operating under today. "Cease and desist, Jasmine." Trevor snapped, his voice echoing with boardroom arrogance, effective immediately. He sneered, looking up at the massive facade of Uncle Desmond's estate and then back down at me. "You really thought you could just walk in here and play the ruthless tycoon? You think buying up some stock makes you a player in the real corporate world? You are nothing but new money. You are a high school dropout who got incredibly lucky with a few boutique hotels and a sympathetic uncle who felt sorry for you. You have absolutely no idea how the real world operates." Kendra immediately rushed up the steps to stand shoulder to shoulder with her husband. The dramatic tears she had been shedding mere minutes ago completely vanished, replaced by that familiar toxic and unearned superiority. She linked her arm tightly through Trevor's, looking down at me as if I were the one being thrown out onto the street. Patricia and Roland dragged themselves up from the lawn, suddenly emboldened by Trevor's aggressive return, standing behind him like cowardly foot soldiers waiting for their general to strike. "You think wealth is just about having a high balance in a bank account?" Jasmine, Trevor mocked, taking a step closer to invade my personal space. "It is about pedigree. It is about knowing the right people, having the right leverage, and understanding the machinery of institutional power. You operate like a street brawler. We operate like surgeons. I have teams of lawyers on retainer who specialize in dismantling arrogant upstarts like you. We will bury you in so much litigation you will not be able to afford the property taxes on this estate, let alone the exorbitant legal fees required to defend it." He pointed a finger at the scattered papers on the ground. "Here is exactly how this is going to work. You are going to instruct your rent-a-cops to carry my in-laws' luggage back inside the house. You are going to sign a quitclaim deed transferring total ownership of this Buckhead property to Patricia and Roland immediately. And you are going to draft a legally binding contract guaranteeing Kendra a 50% stake in the total liquid assets of Desmond's trust. You do that, and I will generously call off my legal team. You refuse, and I will personally see to it that you are ruined. I will strip your little empire down to the studs." I looked at the four of them standing there on my porch. They were a perfect portrait of parasitic greed, convinced that their loud demands and empty threats could somehow override reality. I let out a laugh. It was not a chuckle or a scoff. It was a genuine deep laugh that echoed across the manicured gardens and bounced off the heavy mahogany doors. Patricia visibly flinched at the sound, taking a small step backward. "You are giving me an ultimatum, Trevor," I asked, my voice dripping with pure, unfiltered amusement. "Did you suffer a head injury on your frantic drive over here? Let me remind you of the financial reality we established just 3 days ago. I own Lux Haven Resorts. Lux Haven Resorts just bought a 60% controlling stake in Apex Hospitality. I am effectively your boss. I own the corporate entity that pays your bloated salary. I have the power to liquidate your entire department, cancel your unvested stock options, and fire you before you even finish paying off that sports car parked in my driveway." I leaned forward, dropping my voice to a sharp, commanding tone. "You do not have a legal team, Trevor. You have a corporate legal team that now answers directly to my board of directors. You are a pawn trying to threaten the queen on her own board. Pick up your trash and get off my property before I have Marcus physically throw you into the street." I expected him to pale again. I expected the crushing weight of his reality to finally break whatever pathetic rebellion he was trying to mount. But Trevor did not crumble. Instead, a slow, vicious sneer spread across his face. He looked at Kendra, who grinned back at him, and then he looked at me with an expression of absolute, unadulterated malice. "You are right about one thing, Jasmine," Trevor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous conspiratorial whisper. "You do own a massive stake in Apex Hospitality. You used an incredibly complex web of offshore holding companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands to aggressively purchase those voting shares. It was a brilliant hostile takeover, truly textbook execution. But it was also incredibly aggressive and heavily reliant on moving massive amounts of untraceable capital across international borders in a very short amount of time." I kept my face perfectly blank, but a tiny sliver of cold calculation began to run through my mind. I had used perfectly legal corporate structures managed by top-tier financial advisors, but they were specifically designed for maximum privacy to prevent Apex from seeing the takeover coming. "I may have lost my standing in the boardroom?" Trevor continued, stepping closer, so only I could hear the full venom in his voice. "But I still have my executive access for now. I spent the last 72 hours analyzing every single transaction Lux Haven Resorts made to acquire that stock. And while it might technically be legal, it looks incredibly suspicious to an untrained eye. Or say to a federal investigator hungry for a high-profile bust." Trevor stood up straight, adjusting his silk tie with a sickeningly triumphant smile. "I submitted a highly detailed anonymous tip to the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission this morning. I flagged over 40 of your transactions as potential money laundering and corporate tax fraud. I provided them with the account numbers, the routing details, and the names of all your offshore shell companies. Patricia let out a loud gasp of delight, clapping her hands together while Roland practically beamed with pride at his son-in-law. The federal government does not play games with financial crimes. Jasmine Trevor mocked, his eyes gleaming with victory. They do not care about your sob story or your self-made billionaire status. They see offshore accounts moving massive funds, and they act first and ask questions later. He turned around, taking Kendra's hand and walking slowly back down the marble steps toward his car. He stopped at the bottom, looking back up at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Enjoy the empty house," Jasmine Trevor sneered. "Because I just submitted all the evidence they need. Let us see how long your little hospitality empire lasts when the feds freeze all your corporate accounts tomorrow morning." The morning sun was barely bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my penthouse office when the secure line on my desk began to ring. The shrill mechanical sound shattered the quiet calm of the early dawn. I did not need to look at the caller identification to know who was on the other end. Trevor had promised me a federal nightmare, and he was exactly the kind of desperate cornered animal who would pull the trigger on a suicide mission just to watch the explosion. I picked up the receiver on the second ring. My chief financial officer, Arthur, did not bother with pleasantries. He sounded out of breath, his usual calm corporate cadence replaced by a tight-clipped urgency. The Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission had moved with unprecedented synchronized speed. They had executed a preliminary freeze on all primary operational accounts connected to Lux Haven resorts. Trevor had not just submitted a random anonymous tip on a hotline. He had utilized his senior executive credentials at Apex Hospitality to bypass the standard screening protocols, granting his fabricated claims of money laundering and immediate dangerous legitimacy. Arthur rattled off the list of frozen routing numbers and locked capital streams. He was waiting for me to panic. He was waiting for me to scream or demand miracles or hyperventilate about the millions of dollars currently suspended in bureaucratic limbo. I did none of those things. I thanked Arthur for the update, instructed him to route our immediate operational expenses through our secondary insulated holding companies in Switzerland, and told him to go have a good breakfast. The freeze was a massive inconvenience, a logistical headache designed to paralyze a normal company. But Lux Haven was not a normal company, and I was not a normal CEO. I operated with contingency plans for my contingency plans. I set the receiver down and picked up my personal cell phone. My notifications were already flooded, but they were not from panicked investors. They were from my family's social media accounts. I tapped the screen and opened Facebook, instantly greeted by a masterclass in passive-aggressive delusion. Patricia had posted a status update just 20 minutes ago. It sat at the top of my feed, dripping with unearned superiority and fake religious piety. The text read that the Lord works in mysterious ways, and that sometimes the unchecked greed of a toxic child is corrected by the swift, heavy hand of karma. She went on to say she was praying for those who worship money over their own flesh and blood, because false empires always crumble in the light of truth. Kendra had already liked the post and commented with a single praying hands emoji. Roland had shared the post to his own page, adding a caption about justice finally being served. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, sharp smile pull at the corners of my mouth. They were absolutely giddy. They were sitting in my uncle's stolen house, drinking his stolen champagne, celebrating a temporary administrative hold as if it were a permanent victory. They genuinely believed that Trevor had outsmarted me. They thought that triggering a federal inquiry was the ultimate trump card, a magical spell that would erase my wealth and hand them the keys to the kingdom. They were dancing on a grave that had not even been dug yet. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the glass desk. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the crushing anxiety Trevor had desperately hoped to inflict upon me. I walked across the plush carpet to the executive wet bar and poured myself a cup of stark black coffee. No cream, no sugar. The harsh, bitter taste matched the exact frequency of my focus. I carried the mug over to my primary workstation and booted up my encrypted terminal. Trevor thought he was playing three-dimensional chess by weaponizing the federal government against me. He thought his position as a vice president at Apex gave him the shield he needed to launch a strike without facing any personal blowback. But Trevor was a middle management bureaucrat who had married into a toxic family. He lacked the fundamental understanding of how true corporate warfare was waged. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard security gateways and logging directly into the Apex Hospitality executive mainframe. As the new majority shareholder, my administrative access was absolute. I pulled up the core corporate charter, specifically isolating the executive employment contracts and bylaws. Trevor had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. To make his anonymous tip credible enough to trigger an immediate federal asset freeze, he had to provide the authorities with highly specific proprietary financial data. He had to show them the exact internal routing numbers and acquisition timelines of my stock purchases. In doing so, he had used Apex Hospitality's secure internal networks to gather ammunition against the entity that now owned Apex Hospitality. I opened Section 4, Paragraph 8 of the Executive Bylaws, the Morality and Corporate Conduct Clause. It was a standard but lethal piece of corporate legalese that every executive was forced to sign upon their promotion. By utilizing proprietary company data to initiate a fraudulent, malicious federal investigation against a majority shareholder. Trevor had not just crossed a line. He had committed professional suicide. He had blatantly breached his non-disclosure agreement. He had violated his fiduciary duty to the company and its shareholders. He had engaged in corporate sabotage strictly to protect his personal nepotism network and shield his in-laws from a lawful eviction. He had essentially handed me the exact legal mechanism required to dismantle his entire life. The bylaws were explicitly clear. A breach of fiduciary duty of this magnitude allowed the board of directors to terminate the executive for cause effective immediately. There would be no golden parachute. There would be no severance package. Every single one of his vested and unvested stock options would be instantly forfeited back to the company. His corporate pension would be frozen. He would be stripped of his title, his income, and his industry reputation in a matter of hours. Trevor thought he was starving me out, but all he had really done was tie the noose perfectly around his own neck and hand me the lever to the trapdoor. I took one final slow sip of the black coffee, savoring the dark heat of it. I set the mug down perfectly centered on a leather coaster. I reached out and pressed the direct line to my lead corporate litigator on the intercom. The line connected with a sharp click. "Good morning, Jasmine," the lawyer said, his voice crisp and ready for instruction. I kept my gaze fixed on the digital copy of Trevor's employment contract, glowing brightly on my monitor. The smile on my face was absolute, devoid of any hesitation or mercy. Trevor just handed us the keys to his career. Initiate the hostile takeover protocol. I want him ruined by Friday. The federal freeze on Lux Haven's accounts did not stay a secret for long. Trevor made absolutely certain of that. By noon on Wednesday, the whispers had already started echoing through the marble halls of Atlanta's most exclusive country clubs. By Thursday morning, those whispers had mutated into a deafening roar. Patricia and Kendra did not just participate in the rumor mill, they orchestrated it. They weaponized the federal inquiry with a level of vicious dedication that I would have found impressive if it were not so pathetic. They hit the Buckhead social circuit like a pair of famished wolves. They attended charity luncheons, garden parties, and high society galas, armed with their perfectly rehearsed tears and venomous lies. Kendra played the role of the traumatized niece to absolute perfection. She sat at tables draped in Egyptian cotton, dabbing at her dry eyes with a monogrammed napkin, spinning a tragic tale of manipulation. She told anyone who would listen that I was a ruthless con artist. She claimed that I had isolated a dying Uncle Desmond, withholding his medication and manipulating his frail mind until he signed his estate over to me in a moment of induced confusion. Patricia was the aggressive counterpart. She used the frozen bank accounts as undeniable proof of my impending downfall. She loudly boasted to the Atlanta elite that the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission were preparing a massive federal indictment. She confidently assured her wealthy friends that I would be wearing a federal prison uniform by Christmas, and that the rightful heirs would soon reclaim their stolen legacy. She painted herself as the righteous matriarch, protecting her family from a greedy interloper. The damage to my public image was immediate and catastrophic. My public relations director, Sarah, paced my penthouse office, clutching her tablet like a shield. She read off a terrifying list of cascading disasters. Two major corporate sponsors for our upcoming charity gala had abruptly pulled their funding, citing the need to distance themselves from financial controversy. A highly publicized profile in a premier business magazine had been indefinitely postponed. The optics were an absolute nightmare, and Sarah was begging me to release a statement to combat the character assassination. She wanted press conferences. She wanted legal threats issued to the country clubs. I sat behind my desk watching her panic with complete emotional detachment. I instructed Sarah to cancel all press releases. I told her to let Patricia and Kendra talk. Social capital is a depreciating asset built on gossip and fragile egos. I did not deal in social capital. I dealt in actual, tangible power, and I was not going to waste a single ounce of my energy fighting a public relations war when I was already positioning my troops for a corporate slaughter. I told Sarah to take the rest of the week off and let the rumors burn as hot as they wanted. The secret meeting. I completely ignored the noise. I locked myself in my office, pulling the blinds and cutting off the outside world. I pored over the corporate structure of Apex Hospitality, mapping out the exact chain of command and identifying the key voting members of the executive board. Trevor thought his position as vice president was a fortress, but he was just a middle manager sitting on a throne of matchsticks. I bypassed my public relations team entirely and connected directly with my lead corporate litigator and my chief financial officer. We did not draft press releases. We drafted termination papers. We drafted legal injunctions. We drafted a comprehensive, highly classified dossier outlining exactly how Trevor had violated his non-disclosure agreement and breached his fiduciary duty by weaponizing proprietary company data for a personal vendetta. On Thursday evening, I initiated the next phase of the hostile takeover protocol. Acting as the newly confirmed majority shareholder of Apex Hospitality, I invoked my legal right to call an emergency operational review. I bypassed Trevor and his immediate superiors, sending the mandatory meeting summons directly to the executive board of directors. I kept the agenda intentionally vague, labeling it as a critical review of third-quarter financial projections and structural realignments. I knew exactly how Trevor's mind worked. I knew his staggering arrogance would blind him to the danger. He would look at that vague agenda and assume the board was gathering to praise him. He would assume that his anonymous tip to the feds had elevated his status, and that this meeting was his moment to shine. He probably thought they were going to offer him a promotion for protecting the company's integrity. He had no idea that he was walking directly into a digital execution chamber. The hook. Friday morning arrived with a heavy downpour of rain hammering against the glass walls of my penthouse. The gloomy weather stood in stark contrast to the absolute clarity burning in my mind. At precisely 8:55, I powered up my encrypted terminal and accessed the secure portal for the Apex Hospitality board meeting. I did not log in under my own name. I used a generic shareholder proxy designation, ensuring my true identity remained hidden from the attendee roster. I muted my high-fidelity microphone. I disabled my high-definition camera. I became nothing more than a silent, blank black square on the digital grid, a ghost waiting in the machinery. At 9 o'clock sharp, the video feed from the Apex corporate headquarters went live. The primary camera captured the massive mahogany table in the center of their flagship boardroom. Several senior board members were seated around the table, while others dialed in from various global locations, filling the screen with video feeds from London, New York, and Tokyo. And right there, standing at the head of the table, was Trevor. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that screamed new money, and his posture was practically vibrating with unearned confidence. He was completely in his element, shuffling his presentation notes and beaming at the senior executives as if he had single-handedly saved the company from financial ruin. He took the floor with a wide, arrogant smile. He launched immediately into his presentation, pulling up a series of colorful graphs and inflated quarterly projections. He boasted about his aggressive cost-cutting measures. He bragged about his visionary strategies for the upcoming fiscal year. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he was untouchable, leaning over the table to make direct eye contact with the chairman. He strutted back and forth across the front of the boardroom, pointing at the projection screen and soaking in the polite attention of the board members. He was so completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance that he did not even glance at the digital attendance grid. He had absolutely no idea that the predator he thought he had caged was dialed into the meeting, watching his every move from the digital shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I sat in the absolute quiet of my office, watching the digital feed with clinical fascination. Trevor was standing at the head of the Apex Hospitality boardroom, completely intoxicated by his own performance. He was actively presenting a slide deck on corporate synergy and aggressive restructuring, gesturing enthusiastically toward a graph that projected massive quarterly growth. He spoke about eliminating dead weight and streamlining management protocols with the absolute conviction of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I was currently the majority shareholder of the very company he was attempting to impress. I watched him like an insect trapped under a glass jar. My finger hovered over the trackpad, ready to initiate my camera feed and end his entire career. Before I could click the button, the heavy mahogany doors to my penthouse suite flew open with a violent crash. The thick wood slammed against the wall, rattling the framed architectural blueprints hanging nearby. Kendra marched into the room, her designer heels digging into the plush carpeting. My director of security, Marcus, was right on her heels, his massive hand reaching out to firmly grasp her shoulder and pull her backward. "Let me go!" Kendra shrieked, twisting away from his grip. Her voice was shrill and frantic, completely stripping away the polished country club persona she usually weaponized. "You cannot keep me out of here." Marcus easily maneuvered his frame between Kendra and my desk, his expression dark and ready for violence. I held up my hand, gesturing for him to stop. I wanted to see exactly what kind of desperate play she was attempting. Marcus stepped to the side but remained in the room, his eyes locked on her. Kendra was breathing heavily. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly unraveled, and her expensive makeup could not hide the wild, unhinged panic in her eyes. The smug superiority she had worn on my uncle's front lawn was completely gone. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. $5 million, Jasmine," she demanded, planting both hands on the edge of my desk and leaning forward. "We want a settlement of $5 million right now. You wire the money into our offshore account today, and Trevor will call off the federal dogs." I did not blink. I kept my posture perfectly relaxed, leaning back in my executive leather chair and steepling my fingers together. I let the silence stretch for several long seconds, forcing her to endure the heavy weight of her own desperation. "He will call his contacts at the agency." Kendra continued her words, spilling out in a frantic rush. "He will tell the Internal Revenue Service that the anonymous tip was a terrible mistake made by a disgruntled lower-level employee. He will retract the entire file, and Mom and I will clear your name in Buckhead. We will tell everyone at the club that the rumors were just a massive misunderstanding. The gossip will stop today. Just give us the $5 million and we walk away." I slowly lowered my hands to my desk. My smartphone was resting on the leather blotter just inches from my right hand. With a subtle, practiced swipe of my thumb, I opened the voice memo application and hit the red record button. The screen darkened to conserve battery, but the high-definition microphone was live, capturing every single panicked syllable echoing in the room. "I am confused, Kendra," I said, my voice dangerously soft and completely devoid of urgency. $5 million is a lot of money to extort from someone you just loudly claimed was completely broke and heading to federal prison. But more importantly, why do you even need it? Kendra stiffened her jaw, clenching tight. "Trevor is a vice president at Apex Hospitality." I continued, keeping my tone conversational but sharp. "He drives a new Porsche. You wear vintage Chanel and brag about your exclusive charity galas. You have spent your entire life parading around Atlanta, boasting about your generational wealth and looking down on anyone who actually works for a living. So why are you storming into my office, bypassing security and begging for a cash settlement like a common street thug? Kendra's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The psychological pressure was too much for her fragile ego to withstand. The illusion she had spent decades maintaining shattered right in front of me. Because it is a lie, she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She slammed her hands down on my desk again, her manicured nails biting into the leather. You think we have money. We have debt, Jasmine. Crushing, suffocating debt. Trevor's corporate salary barely covers the monthly interest on his massive business loans. He has been quietly pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into useless tech startups that keep completely failing. And Patricia and Roland, I prompted, pushing the blade just a fraction deeper. They do not have a pension! Kendra wailed, tears of actual panic finally spilling over her mascara and running down her cheeks. They have absolutely nothing left. They took out a second and third mortgage on their house just to pay for Trevor's initial startup capital and to keep my luxury lifestyle afloat. They funded everything on credit cards and borrowed equity so we would not look like absolute failures in front of their wealthy country club friends. She was hyperventilating now, the ugly truth pouring out of her in an unstoppable flood of misery. The bank is circling, Jasmine, she sobbed, gripping the edge of the desk. They are officially threatening foreclosure. If you do not pay us this settlement, Mom and Dad will lose the house by the end of the month. Trevor goes completely bankrupt. We lose everything. We will literally be on the street. You have the capital. You stole Uncle Desmond's fortune. You owe us this money to fix our lives. The room fell dead silent, save for Kendra's ragged, hyperventilating breaths and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I let her stand there, marinating in the absolute humiliation of her complete, unvarnished confession. She had just admitted to a massive financial conspiracy. She had just confessed that the entire foundation of their arrogant superiority was built on fraudulent loans and mortgaged lies. I looked down at my phone and tapped the screen cleanly, saving the high-definition audio file to my secure encrypted cloud server. It was the final nail in their collective coffin. I looked back up at her, my expression completely devoid of mercy. Thanks for the clarification, Kendra, I said, my voice slicing through the room with lethal precision. Now watch this. I turned my attention away from her tear-stained face and back to my laptop monitor. Trevor was still holding court in the digital boardroom, oblivious to the execution currently taking place in my office. He was passionately concluding his presentation, asking the senior board members for their feedback on his visionary leadership. I moved my mouse and firmly clicked the camera icon. My generic blank square instantly vanished from the digital grid. My face populated the massive high-definition projection screen mounted directly behind Trevor at the head of the Apex Hospitality boardroom. The senior executives sitting around the mahogany table immediately stopped talking. Their eyes widened in collective shock as they stared at the screen, recognizing the new majority shareholder dialing in from the shadows. Trevor noticed their sudden silence. He slowly turned around, following their gaze to the projection screen. The arrogant smile completely melted off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Elias Sterling never panicked. That was the first thought that crystallized in my mind as I sat gripping the red receiver. In all the years I had known the man, he had been a pillar of absolute stoic calm. He had navigated my Uncle Desmond through aggressive corporate audits, hostile boardroom coups, and vicious legal battles without so much as raising his voice. Hearing him breathe heavily into the phone, his words clipped and frantic, sent an immediate spike of adrenaline straight into my veins. The triumph of executing Trevor live on the corporate feed evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a new threat. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass surface of my desk. I told Elias to take a breath, to slow down, and to tell me exactly what was happening. I needed facts, not panic. Elias let out a long, ragged sigh. He explained that he had been running routine forensic audits on the final tier of Desmond's holding companies. It was standard protocol, a necessary step to clear the estate through the final stages of the probate courts. Desmond had a vast and complex portfolio spread across multiple trusts and offshore entities. Elias had been meticulously closing out the minor accounts when he stumbled across a hidden financial instrument buried deep within a defunct shell company. It was a commercial line of credit, Elias explained, his voice steadying but still laced with disbelief. A massive, high-risk commercial line of credit issued through a private wealth management bank in Delaware. It was completely off the books, obscured behind layers of corporate shielding that Desmond never used. I asked him why a line of credit was causing him to panic. My uncle was a billionaire. He utilized debt as a tool for leverage all the time. Because Desmond did not open this line of credit, Elias replied bluntly. Patricia and Roland did. The silence in my office grew heavy. I stared blankly at the wall across the room, my mind rapidly processing the implication of his words. My parents were notorious for their financial incompetence. They had spent decades living far beyond their means, treating their credit cards like infinite sources of free cash. No legitimate private wealth bank would ever issue them a massive commercial credit line based on their own disastrous financial history. They used Desmond. Elias continued, anticipating my exact realization. 10 years ago, when Desmond was briefly hospitalized for a minor cardiac issue, he granted your mother a highly restricted temporary power of attorney to handle his medical directives. Patricia and Roland took that document and they completely bastardized it. They forged his secondary authorizations and presented him to the Delaware Bank as the primary guarantor for their personal debt. They used your uncle's name, his pristine credit rating, and his verified assets to blindly co-sign for their fraudulent loans. A cold, dark fury began to pool in my stomach. The sheer audacity of their betrayal was staggering. While Uncle Desmond was lying in a hospital bed trusting his sister to manage his health, Patricia and Roland were busy stealing his financial identity. They had weaponized his trust to fund their pathetic illusion of high society grandeur. Elias began listing the withdrawals, reading directly from the bank statements he had just uncovered. The money had not been used for investments or property development. It had been systematically drained to fund Kendra's absurd lifestyle. Patricia and Roland had funneled millions of dollars into offshore accounts to pay for Kendra's lavish destination weddings, her luxury vehicles, her European shopping sprees, and the down payments on Trevor's endless string of failed tech startups. They had literally mortgaged Desmond's legacy to buy their golden child a fake crown. They lived like royalty on stolen credit for a decade. They had been terrified of Desmond finding out, so they had quietly serviced the interest payments just enough to keep the bank from triggering an audit. But when Desmond's health began to rapidly decline last year, they realized their protective shield was about to vanish. They knew that once Desmond passed away, his estate would go into probate, and the forensic accountants would eventually find the fraudulent loans. That was why they had been so absolutely desperate to challenge the will. That was why Kendra and Patricia had launched their vicious smear campaign, claiming I had manipulated a dying man. They were not just angry about losing out on a windfall, they were fighting for their very survival. They needed to control the estate so they could quietly bury the fraudulent debt before the probate courts uncovered their 10-year criminal conspiracy. I asked Elias what the immediate liability was. I needed to know the exact blast radius of this financial bomb. Elias did not sugarcoat the reality. He told me that because the estate transfer was still actively sitting in probate, the Delaware Bank had legal standing to protect their investments. The moment they realized Desmond had passed away, they initiated a protective protocol. The bank had quietly placed a massive commercial lien against Desmond's primary holding accounts. If Patricia and Roland default on those loans, Elias explained, his voice dropping to a grim whisper, the bank has the absolute legal right to collect the principal, the interest, and the accumulated penalties directly from the guarantor. They will bypass your parents completely. The bank will seize Desmond's entire $15 million estate to cover the debt. The probate courts will freeze the transfer, and every single asset you just inherited will be liquidated to pay for Kendra's fake life. I slowly stood up from my desk, pacing across the thick carpet. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. Kendra bursting into my office demanding a $5 million extortion payment was not just an act of petty revenge. It was a desperate, panic-driven shakedown. She needed that exact amount of cash to pay off the bank and release the lien before the probate court finalized my ownership of the estate. Trevor's fraudulent IRS tip had been a calculated distraction designed to freeze my operational capital and force me to the negotiating table. They were trying to hold me hostage with a federal inquiry, so I would blindly hand over the cash they needed to cover their tracks. I asked Elias how much time we had to navigate the lien. I assumed we could outmaneuver the bank using our own legal team, proving the initial power of attorney was manipulated and shielding the estate from liability. It would be a lengthy court battle, but we had the resources to fight a prolonged war of attrition. "There is no time to fight," Elias warned, delivering the final devastating blow. "The bank is not waiting for a court order, Jasmine. They are moving to execute the lien immediately." I stopped pacing. "Why would they execute a lien before the debt matures?" I demanded. "Because the debt has already matured," Elias replied, his voice trembling with sheer anxiety. "They haven't made a single mortgage payment in 6 months, Jasmine. Patricia and Roland are completely broke. They stopped servicing the debt the moment Desmond died. They are deliberately defaulting on the loans. They know the bank will bypass them and target the guarantor. They are intentionally letting the entire $15 million empire burn strictly to drag your inheritance down with them." The phone line went dead, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the penthouse air conditioning. The sheer magnitude of my parents' sociopathy settled over me like a heavy winter coat. Patricia and Roland were not merely greedy, they were financial terrorists. They were perfectly willing to detonate a $15 million inheritance just to extort a single property from me. They believed they had trapped me in an impossible checkmate. Either I publicly surrender the Buckhead estate to them, so they can sell it and cover their fraudulent tracks, or I watch a Delaware bank liquidate my Uncle Desmond's entire corporate empire to settle their defaulted loans. It was a classic hostage situation designed to force my compliance through sheer terror. Before I could even begin to formulate a legal countermeasure, the notification chime on my laptop shattered my concentration. An email had just dropped into my personal inbox. It was from Roland, but he had boldly copied the entire extended family roster. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and distant relatives I had not spoken to in over a decade were all clearly visible on the distribution list. The subject line read, "Family Healing and Estate Resolution" in bold, arrogant lettering. The message was an absolute masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation. Roland formally invited everyone to a family summit at Chop's Lobster Bar, one of the most exclusive and notoriously expensive steakhouses in the heart of Atlanta. He wrote a lengthy, nauseating paragraph about how the recent passing of Uncle Desmond had fractured the family and how it was time to put aside our bitter differences to reach a fair and equitable agreement regarding his legacy. He deliberately framed the extortion as a loving compromise. He suggested that if I simply did the right thing and returned the Buckhead estate to its rightful owners, they would gladly resume their financial obligations and ensure the rest of my inheritance remained perfectly intact. They were putting a gun to my head in front of a live audience, betting that my desire to protect my newly acquired wealth would force me to fold under the intense pressure of public family scrutiny. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have frantically called their defense attorneys and prepared for a brutal, drawn-out probate battle. I did none of those things. I did not get mad. I got to work. I pulled up the encrypted financial files Elias had just transferred to my secure server. I bypassed the standard summaries and dug directly into the raw data isolating the specific commercial line of credit my parents had fraudulently secured. I traced the routing numbers and corporate identifiers back to their absolute origin. The debt was not held by a massive, faceless international conglomerate like I initially suspected. It had been bundled and sold. It was currently held by a mid-sized private lending firm operating out of Chicago. They specialized in high-yield, high-risk commercial debt and distressed assets. That was all the leverage I needed. I picked up my phone and made 3 highly specific calls to my elite team of financial advisors. The first call was to my lead portfolio manager. I instructed him to immediately liquidate a block of my underperforming overseas assets and free up a massive reserve of liquid cash. I needed heavy capital ready to deploy by the end of the business day. The second call was to my corporate acquisitions director. I gave him the exact name of the Chicago lending firm and told him to bypass their middle management and reach out directly to their executive board. I did not want to negotiate a settlement for my parents' mortgage. I wanted to purchase the entire specific debt portfolio that contained their fraudulent loans. The loans were currently in default, which meant they were officially a toxic asset on the Chicago firm's balance sheet. I knew they would jump at the chance to offload a bad debt if a wealthy buyer swooped in with a premium all-cash offer. I was going to buy their debt for pennies on the dollar and assume total, absolute control of their financial existence. I would become the bank. The third call was to my private security team. I needed them to secure the perimeter of the steakhouse on the night of the summit and ensure there would be absolutely no interruptions from the press or uninvited guests. I was preparing a slaughter, and I demanded a pristine environment. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp, cool breeze that swept through the bustling streets of Buckhead. I stepped out of my chauffeured town car and handed the keys to the valet, smoothing the fabric of my jacket. I did not look like a woman on the verge of losing a $15 million empire or a daughter arriving to beg for mercy. I looked like new money personified. I wore a custom-tailored crimson suit that fit me with lethal absolute perfection. The vibrant red fabric commanded attention, radiating power and unapologetic dominance. My hair was impeccably styled, pulled back into a sleek professional knot. My expression was entirely unbothered and untouchable. I was not walking into a negotiation. I was walking into a coronation. I stepped through the heavy mahogany doors of the steakhouse, ignoring the stares of the wealthy patrons dining in the main room. I bypassed the hostess stand and glided down the softly lit hallway toward the private dining room Roland had reserved for his grand theater production. I paused just outside the thick frosted glass doors, listening to the muffled sounds of the gathering inside. The heavy wood blocked most of the noise, but the shrill, desperate cadence of my mother's voice pierced right through the barrier. Patricia was already in peak performance mode. She had not even waited for the first course to arrive before launching her offensive. I could hear her crying fake, desperate tears to my aunts, spinning a tragic web of absolute deceit. She was painting me as a ruthless, cold-blooded thief who had isolated a sick man, manipulated his dying mind, and stolen their rightful generational wealth. She was setting the stage, ensuring the entire extended family viewed me as the villain before I even walked into the room. She was practically begging them to help her pressure me into surrendering the estate. I rested my hand on the polished brass handle of the door. A slow, sharp smile pulled at the corners of my mouth. Patricia thought she was the director of this little stage play. She had no idea the theater had just been sold. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the light. The private dining room of Chop's Lobster Bar instantly went dead silent. The atmosphere inside the room was thick with the smell of seared prime beef, roasted garlic, and expensive heavy perfumes. Patricia was sitting near the center of the massive oak table holding court. She was in mid-sob, a delicate lace handkerchief pressed to her cheek, surrounded by my aunts and uncles who were leaning in with expressions of deep, gullible sympathy. When my crimson heels clicked against the hardwood floor, the entire room froze. Every head snapped in my direction. The murmurs of pity died in their throats. I did not look like the desperate cornered niece they had been promised. I did not look like a woman facing federal indictment or financial ruin. I looked like the owner of the building. The vibrant red fabric of my tailored suit commanded the space, radiating absolute, unapologetic power. I walked directly to the only empty chair at the head of the long table, completely ignoring the hostile glares from my cousins. I scanned the faces of my extended family. My aunts looked at me with undisguised contempt, completely sold on the narrative Patricia had been feeding them. But then my eyes found Kendra sitting quietly in the far corner. Her face was ashen. She was practically vibrating with terror, clutching her water glass so tightly her knuckles were white. Kendra knew exactly what I was capable of. She had watched her husband's career evaporate live on a corporate feed just hours earlier. She clearly had not warned my parents. She was too cowardly to admit that her extortion attempt had failed, and now she was trapped at this table watching a train crash in slow motion. Patricia and Roland were still operating under the absolute delusion that they held the winning hand. Roland stood up at the opposite end of the table. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and puffed out his chest, attempting to project the aura of a benevolent, forgiving patriarch. He spoke in a low, patronizing tone, carefully modulated to make him sound entirely reasonable to the extended family members witnessing the exchange. Jasmine, he began, his voice dripping with fake sorrow. We are glad you decided to show up. Your mother and I have been sick with worry about the federal inquiries and the frozen accounts. We know you are in over your head. Uncle Desmond's estate is too complex for you, and the legal trouble you have brought upon yourself is tearing this family apart. I did not interrupt him. I simply sat back in my chair, crossing my legs and resting my hands in my lap. I maintained a blank, clinical expression. We want to help you, Roland continued, emboldened by my silence. Family is more important than money, Jasmine. We are willing to step in and clean up this mess, but sacrifices have to be made to correct past mistakes. You manipulated Desmond in his final days, but we are willing to forgive that if you make things right today. He paused, letting the heavy silence underscore his next words. He laid his hands flat on the table and delivered his ultimatum. Sign the Buckhead estate over to us, Jasmine. You can keep the remaining cash from the accounts once the federal freeze is lifted, but the house stays with the real family. Do it tonight and we will fix the mortgage issue with the bank in Delaware. We will resume our payments and save your uncle's remaining assets from being seized. If you refuse, the bank takes everything and you walk away with nothing. We are offering you a lifeline. Take it. The aunts and uncles nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring their approval of Roland's supposed generosity. They actually believed he was doing me a favor. I did not answer him. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my character or launch into a desperate explanation of their massive criminal fraud. Instead, I caught the eye of the head waiter who had been hovering nervously near the frosted glass doors. I casually raised 2 fingers, signaling him to approach. I will have the bone and ribeye cooked medium rare and a glass of sparkling water with lemon. I said, my tone perfectly conversational. The waiter nodded frantically and vanished from the room. The family stared at me in profound disbelief. Roland's confident posture visibly faltered. Patricia lowered her lace handkerchief, her fake tears drying up instantly, replaced by a tight, nervous scowl. They wanted me to yell. They wanted me to cry and beg so they could justify their vicious extortion to the audience they had assembled. My complete and utter indifference was psychologically agonizing to them. The room sat in suspended animation while we waited. No one spoke. The tension was so thick it felt like physical pressure against the walls. When the waiter finally returned and placed the heavy, sizzling plate of steak in front of me, the aroma filled the silent room. I picked up my silver steak knife and fork. I slowly and methodically sliced off a piece of the perfectly seared meat. The sharp scrape of the silver blade against the ceramic plate was the only sound echoing in the massive dining room. I placed the food in my mouth and chewed, taking my time, letting the absolute silence stretch until it became entirely suffocating. I took a sip of my sparkling water, wiping my mouth with a linen napkin. Roland's face began to flush with rising anger. He opened his mouth to shout, to demand an answer, but I raised a single finger, stopping him dead in his tracks. I swallowed my food and carefully placed my silverware down perfectly parallel on the edge of the plate. Then I reached down into my leather briefcase resting on the floor beside my chair. My fingers wrapped around the heavy spine of a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was the original physical accounting log Elias Sterling had dug out of my uncle's private vault and couriered directly to my office that afternoon. I stood up, gripping the massive book. I walked slowly down the length of the table, the crimson fabric of my suit catching the dim restaurant lighting. Every eye tracked my movement. I stopped right behind Patricia's chair. She stiffened, refusing to turn around, but I could see a bead of sweat forming on the back of her neck. I raised the heavy ledger high into the air and slammed it down directly onto Patricia's porcelain dinner plate with explosive, violent force. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The thick plate cracked cleanly in half. Patricia's crystal wine glass toppled over and shattered, sending a tidal wave of expensive dark red wine splashing across the pristine white tablecloth and pouring directly onto her lap. She let out a sharp, piercing shriek, pushing her chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed to the floor. The red wine bloomed across her expensive dress, looking exactly like blood. The entire extended family gasped. Several aunts and uncles jumped to their feet in sheer shock, knocking their silverware to the ground. The thick frosted glass doors of the private dining room rattled from the impact, and the ambient noise from the main restaurant outside completely ceased as patrons turned toward the sudden commotion. I did not flinch. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the ruined, wine-soaked table, locking my eyes directly onto my father standing at the opposite end of the room. The absolute authority in my posture commanded total silence. "You are right, Roland," I said, my voice projecting clearly and carrying enough lethal dominance to be heard by every single person in the restaurant. "You did forge Uncle Desmond's signature 10 years ago to secure fraudulent loans and fund your pathetic illusion of a lifestyle. But you severely underestimated my uncle." I flipped the heavy leather cover open. The thick parchment pages fell flat against the ruined table. I did not look at Patricia, who was still trembling in her wine-soaked dress. I looked directly at the aunts and uncles who had been ready to crucify me just 5 minutes ago. I wanted them to see every single piece of the truth. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the first exhibit. It was a side-by-side forensic handwriting analysis. On the left was Uncle Desmond's authenticated signature pulled directly from his verified corporate filings. On the right was the sloppy, frantic forgery Roland had scribbled onto the temporary power of attorney. The discrepancy was so glaring a child could have spotted it. I watched my Aunt Martha lean forward, squinting at the page. The sympathetic tears she had been shedding for my mother instantly dried up. I turned the page, the heavy paper rustling in the quiet room. "Here are the official disbursement records from the Delaware Private Wealth Bank," I announced, my voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Let us take a walk down memory lane, shall we? Let us see exactly what my parents deemed more important than my uncle's financial security and our family legacy." I read the line items aloud, taking my time, letting the staggering numbers sink into the minds of everyone sitting at the table. $250,000 wired to a holding company in the Cayman Islands to fund Trevor's first spectacular failure of a tech startup. $180,000 transferred to a luxury dealership in Miami to purchase Kendra a custom Porsche for her 25th birthday. $500,000 funneled into a private event planning firm to cover Kendra's absurdly lavish destination wedding in the south of France. I looked over at Kendra. She was pressing herself so hard into the back of her leather chair it looked like she was trying to merge with the upholstery. She could not meet my gaze. She could not look at the extended family members who had attended that very wedding, completely unaware it had been financed by stolen money. Aunt Martha let out a sharp, audible gasp, pressing her hand to her mouth. Uncle Frank shook his head, his face turning a deep shade of purple as he stared at Roland in absolute disgust. The narrative Patricia had spun, the tragic tale of a victimized sister being bullied by a greedy niece, was disintegrating right in front of their eyes. The entire room suddenly understood that Patricia and Roland were not victims. They were parasites who had been bleeding the family dry for a decade. Roland realized he was rapidly losing his audience. His grand theater production had been hijacked and the crowd was turning against him. He slammed his hand flat against the table, causing the remaining silverware to rattle against the china. He let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded completely hollow and desperate. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at me, trying to project his fake patriarchal authority. "You are grasping at straws, Jasmine," he barked, stepping away from his chair. "You think you are a hotshot legal expert now, just because you read a few old bank statements. That paperwork is a decade old. Do you hear me? 10 years. He looked around the room, appealing to the stunned relatives, spreading his arms wide, as if he had just uncovered a massive flaw in my logic. The statute of limitations on financial fraud in that jurisdiction is 7 years, he declared, his voice booming with arrogant triumph. "You cannot call the police, Jasmine. You cannot involve the federal authorities. You cannot file a criminal complaint. You cannot do absolutely anything to us." He sneered, crossing his arms over his chest, looking down the length of the table at me with pure, unadulterated smugness. "You brought a dead file to a live negotiation," he mocked. "The police cannot touch us, and the bank is still going to seize your precious inheritance unless you sign that house over to me tonight." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I slowly closed the heavy leather ledger. I let the satisfying thud of the cover echo in the room, cutting off his pathetic victory speech. I leaned forward, bracing my hands on the edge of the table, keeping my eyes locked on Roland. My smile was pure surgical ice. "You are absolutely right, Roland," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register that forced everyone in the room to hold their breath. "I cannot call the police, and I have no intention of calling the federal authorities, because Uncle Desmond never wanted to call them either." I watched the smug satisfaction drain from Roland's face, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. He uncrossed his arms, letting them fall to his sides. "Desmond was a billionaire with a network of the most aggressive forensic accountants on the eastern seaboard," I explained slowly, ensuring every single word landed with maximum impact. "Did you honestly believe you could walk into a private wealth bank, forge his signature on a massive commercial credit line, and he would not be instantly notified? He knew exactly what you did the very same day the ink dried on those fraudulent loan documents." Patricia let out a quiet, choked gasp, but I ignored her, keeping my focus entirely on Roland. "He received the alert before the bank even dispersed your first withdrawal," I continued. "But Desmond was a complicated man. Despite your endless greed, he refused to send his own sister to federal prison. He refused to let the family name be dragged through a highly publicized criminal trial just because his brother-in-law was a pathetic, desperate thief. So he instructed Elias Sterling to execute a completely different strategy." I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my crimson jacket, enjoying the absolute terror radiating from my parents. "He did not report the fraud to the authorities," I said. "Instead, he utilized a silent proxy corporation and he quietly bought your debt." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that occurs right before a massive structure collapses. Patricia stopped dabbing at her ruined dress. She looked up, her mascara slightly smeared, her expression twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She looked at Roland, who had suddenly turned the color of wet ash, and then she looked back at me. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white against the dark wood. "Bought our debt," she whispered, her voice shaking so badly the words barely made it past her lips. "What does that mean?" I did not answer my mother immediately. I let her agonizing question hang in the heavy air of the private dining room, allowing the sheer terror of the unknown to wrap tightly around her throat. I reached back into the thick leather ledger resting on the table. My manicured fingers slid beneath a heavy piece of certified parchment paper stamped with the unmistakable embossed gold seal of the Chicago lending firm. I pulled it free and slid it across the smooth mahogany surface, right through the puddle of spilled red wine, until it came to a dead stop inches from Roland's shaking hands. "It means Uncle Desmond was a grandmaster playing a long game while you two were busy acting like petty thieves," I stated, my voice perfectly level and chillingly calm. "When his forensic accountants alerted him to your fraudulent commercial credit line, he did not call the police. He knew a public trial would humiliate the family name. So instead, he called his private brokers. He instructed them to aggressively acquire a controlling interest in the specific private lending firm that issued your mortgage. He bought the bank, Roland. He owned the paper on your house. He owned the titles to your cars. He owned every single cent of the debt you fraudulently acquired." Roland stared at the certified document as if it were a live explosive. His hands trembled violently as he picked up the wine-stained paper. His eyes darted across the dense legal jargon, the notarized signatures, and the irrefutable transfer of ownership. The arrogant patriarch who had confidently demanded my surrender just moments ago was rapidly disintegrating right in front of my eyes. The expensive tailored suit he wore suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his deflating frame. "This is illegal," Roland stammered, his voice cracking, pitching into a desperate, frantic register. "He cannot just buy our debt without notifying us. We have rights as borrowers. You cannot just legally acquire a commercial mortgage in secret. Commercial debt is bundled, packaged, and sold between private wealth management firms every single day. I countered smoothly, cutting through his pathetic attempt at a legal defense. You signed a high-risk commercial line of credit using forged authorization documents. You waived your standard consumer protections the second you committed federal fraud to secure the funds. Desmond owned your entire pathetic existence for a decade, and he let you live in your delusion because it amused him to hold your leash. Patricia let out a ragged, breathless gasp. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes wide and panicked, searching for any lifeline among the extended family. Martha Frank, she pleaded, her voice shrill and breaking. You cannot let her do this. We are her parents. She is trying to throw us out on the street. She is trying to leave us completely homeless over a simple misunderstanding. Aunt Martha did not offer a shred of sympathy. She slowly stood up from her chair, her face a mask of absolute disgust, and took 2 deliberate steps away from my mother. Uncle Frank simply crossed his arms and looked at the ceiling, refusing to even acknowledge Roland. The entire family had just witnessed the undeniable proof of a decade-long criminal conspiracy. Patricia and Roland had stolen from their own brother to fund a fake life of luxury, and the extended family was universally horrified. The public forum my parents had so carefully orchestrated to pressure me into submission had instantly transformed into their own public execution. We can fix this! Roland interrupted, his voice dripping with a sickening sudden desperation. He dropped the document back onto the table and held his hands up in a placating gesture. Jasmine, please. We are family. We can renegotiate the terms of the loan. We can structure a payment plan. We will pay back every single dollar we owe the estate. Just give us time to liquidate some assets. You do not have any assets to liquidate, I reminded him, my tone dripping with absolute surgical precision. And you do not have the leverage to negotiate a payment plan because you violated the core terms of the loan agreement 6 months ago. I leaned forward, bracing my hands flat against the table, locking my gaze directly onto his pale, terrified face. You thought you were so incredibly clever, I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. You stopped making your mortgage payments the very second Uncle Desmond passed away. You deliberately defaulted on your loans because you assumed the liability would fall back onto Desmond's estate and drain my inheritance. You intentionally triggered the default acceleration clause, trying to weaponize your own bankruptcy to force me into giving you the Buckhead estate. You tried to burn my empire to the ground. Kendra let out a loud, uncontrollable sob from the corner of the room. The reality of the situation was finally crashing down on her. Her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, her entire identity as a wealthy society wife had been entirely funded by a criminal fraud scheme that was now actively collapsing. Her husband Trevor was already fired and facing federal inquiry for his own corporate espionage. Now her parents were financially ruined. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing so violently her shoulders shook. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my crimson jacket, letting my eyes sweep across their pale, terrified faces. The absolute panic radiating from my parents was intoxicating. They had spent my entire life making me feel small, insignificant, and unworthy. They had treated me like a disappointing financial burden, while they lived like royalty on stolen money. Now the scales were permanently, violently balanced. And since the probate courts have officially cleared, I stated, delivering the crushing blow with lethal clarity, since I just successfully inherited the absolute entirety of Uncle Desmond's $15 million estate, I am now the sole managing director of his holding companies. I own the private lending firm in Chicago. I own the paper on your mortgage. I own your debt. Patricia let out a low, agonizing wail. She slumped forward in her chair, her face hovering dangerously close to the shattered remains of her dinner plate. You cannot do this to your own blood, she whispered, her voice hollow and entirely broken. You are a monster, Jasmine. I did not feel a single shred of guilt. I looked at the woman who had happily tried to extort me just hours prior and felt nothing but cold, unyielding satisfaction. The head waiter cautiously stepped back into the private dining room, holding a small leather folio containing the bill for the massive steakhouse dinner my parents had arranged. He looked absolutely terrified, sensing the intense hostility suffocating the room. He hesitated, unsure of who to approach. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my heavy matte black American Express card. I did not look at the waiter. I kept my eyes locked directly on my parents as I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back with a loud scrape. I tossed the black card onto the table. It landed right next to the forged signature and the certified bank documents with a heavy authoritative thud. "You didn't trap my estate," I said loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. "You just handed me the deed to your house, your cars, and everything you own. And the debt is due. Today." When I tossed the black American Express card onto the table, the sharp smack of the heavy metal plastic against the mahogany resonated like a gavel striking a judge's block. The restaurant around us seemed to hold its breath. The ambient noise from the main dining room faded into insignificance. The reality of their absolute ruin finally shattered the last remnants of Roland and Patricia's arrogant facade. Roland stared at the black card, his jaw slack, the color completely draining from his face until he looked practically translucent. He tried to speak, to form another lie, to issue another empty threat, but his vocal cords failed him. He collapsed backward into his chair, the starch going out of his spine. He was no longer the benevolent patriarch commanding the room. He was a defeated, broken old man who had finally been caught in a trap of his own, making suffocating under the weight of a massive debt he could never possibly repay. Patricia could not process the silence. She could not process the fact that her luxury lifestyle, her exclusive country club memberships, and her pristine social standing had just been violently ripped away by the very daughter she had spent decades dismissing as collateral damage. The illusion of her superiority was gone. She let out a guttural, desperate sob. It was not the theatrical, practiced weeping she had used earlier to manipulate the aunts and uncles. This was raw, unfiltered terror. She scrambled out of her chair, her movements clumsy and frantic. Her expensive, wine-soaked dress clung heavy to her legs as she stumbled around the edge of the massive oak table. Before I could step back, she threw herself onto the hardwood floor right at my feet. She reached up with trembling hands and grabbed the crimson fabric of my tailored blazer, clutching it like a drowning woman clinging to the last piece of a wrecked ship. "Jasmine, please!" she wailed, her voice cracking into a shrill, agonizing pitch as tears streamed down her ruined makeup. "You cannot do this. We are your parents. You are my daughter. You cannot throw us out on the street. We will lose everything. All our friends are standing our home. Please, Jasmine, have mercy. We made mistakes, but we are family." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I felt the desperate weight of her hands pulling at my jacket. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and suddenly, the lavish private dining room of Chop's Lobster Bar vanished. I was not a 35-year-old billionaire executive anymore. I was 15. I was standing in the middle of a crowded, echoing airport terminal, clutching a cheap canvas duffel bag, watching this exact same woman turn her back on me to board a first-class flight to Paris with her new husband and his perfect children. I remembered the cold, dismissive shrug she gave me when I begged her not to leave me behind. I remembered the sheer panic of realizing I had been discarded because I did not fit into her upgraded aesthetic. I opened my eyes. The frightened 15-year-old girl was gone. The managing director of Desmond Holdings looked down at Patricia with absolute clinical indifference. I reached into my designer purse. My fingers brushed past the heavy legal documents and found my leather wallet. I unzipped the side compartment and deliberately pulled out two crisp, unwrinkled $100 bills. I held them up between my index and middle finger, letting the dim, warm light of the chandelier catch the green ink. Patricia's frantic sobbing hitched in her throat. She looked up at the money, a flicker of desperate, confused hope crossing her tear-stained face. She actually thought I was offering her a lifeline. I opened my fingers and let the bills flutter down. They landed directly in the puddle of spilled red wine on the floor right next to her trembling knees. The wine immediately began to soak into the crisp paper, staining the edges pink. "Here is $200 for a motel." "Patricia," I said, my voice eerily calm. perfectly echoing the exact tone and phrasing she had used 20 years ago at Gate 24. "You can figure it out. I am sure Kendra has room for you." The poetic justice of the exact dollar amount struck her like a physical blow. The recognition flashed in her eyes, followed instantly by absolute despair. She let go of my blazer, her hands dropping limply to her sides. She stared at the soggy currency on the floor in profound disbelief. She scrambled backward, slipping slightly in the spilled wine, looking wildly around the room for anyone who would save her. Her eyes frantically locked onto her golden child. "Kendra." Patricia pleaded, her voice a pathetic rasp echoing off the silent walls. "Kendra, honey, you have to help us. Trevor makes good money. You have that beautiful guest house out back. We just need a place to stay until we can sort this out. We can move in tonight." Kendra sat frozen in her heavy leather chair, her face a mask of pale horror. She looked at me, her eyes wide with newfound terror, then at the damning financial documents on the table, and finally at her mother groveling on the floor. She did not say a word. She just slowly, mechanically shook her head, shrinking away from Patricia, as if her mother were suddenly infectious. Trevor, who had been exceptionally quiet and sweating profusely the entire evening, suddenly stood up. The massive tech startup failure I had mentioned earlier had clearly broken his spirit, and the reality of the impending federal SEC fines was entirely crushing his remaining sanity. He looked down at Patricia with undisguised contempt, his face twisting in a sneer of pure self-preservation. "Help you!" Trevor spat, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and sheer panic. "I do not have a job. My corporate accounts are frozen. I am facing federal indictment by the Securities and Exchange Commission because your idiot husband convinced me to funnel his stolen money through my offshore accounts to keep my firm afloat. I am completely broke. I am not taking you in. I am trying to figure out how to stay out of a federal penitentiary." Trevor did not wait for a response. He did not look at Kendra. He grabbed his expensive wool coat from the back of his chair, roughly shoved his way past his paralyzed wife, and stormed toward the frosted glass doors. He hit the heavy doors with his shoulder, pushing them open with enough force to rattle the brass hinges. He marched out into the main restaurant, leaving Kendra sitting at the table in stunned, breathless silence. She did not even try to follow him. She just stared blankly at the empty doorway, her perfect, lavish life crumbling into dust right alongside her parents. Exactly 14 days later, the tinted glass of my chauffeured Escalade provided the perfect viewing gallery for the final act of this decade-long tragedy. I sat in the spacious leather-back seat, a steaming cup of black coffee resting in the cup holder, watching the red and blue emergency lights bounce off the pristine brick facade of the Buckhead mansion. Two cruisers from the Fulton County Sheriff Department were parked at sharp angles across the circular driveway, effectively blocking any attempt at a retreat. It was execution day. The fallout from the private dining room at Chop's Lobster Bar had been swift, absolute, and entirely merciless. When Trevor walked out that door, he triggered a massive chain reaction of pure self-preservation. He immediately filed for divorce to distance himself from Kendra and our family's highly radioactive legal standing. Kendra was left sitting in her massive empty house, waiting for the federal investigators to seize her remaining assets. But the true devastation fell squarely on my parents. Aunt Martha and Uncle Frank did exactly what I knew they would do. They disseminated the truth. The forensic accounting documents, the forged signature, and the undeniable proof of Roland stealing millions from his own brother to fund a fake life of luxury spread through our extended family network in a matter of hours. The ostracization was absolutely complete. Patricia's frantic, sobbing voicemails begging for a temporary place to stay were met with a wall of dead silence. Roland's arrogant demands for a family summit were ignored. Every single aunt, uncle, and cousin completely severed contact. They locked their doors and washed their hands of the parasites who had embarrassed our bloodline. Even the prestigious country club revoked their membership by the end of the week, citing a sudden failure to meet their financial obligations. My parents were marooned on an island of their own making, and the water was rapidly rising. I watched through the window as the heavy mahogany front doors of the estate swung open. A uniformed deputy stepped out first, holding a thick metal clipboard. Then Roland emerged. The sight of the former confident patriarch was jarring. He was wearing a faded, wrinkled polo shirt and ill-fitting khaki pants. His posture was completely broken, his shoulders slumped forward under an invisible crushing weight. He was dragging a heavy black contractor trash bag down the front marble steps. Patricia followed a few paces behind him. The woman who had obsessed over designer labels and flawless salon blowouts looked entirely unrecognizable. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and her face was pale and heavily drawn. She was struggling to carry two bulging trash bags, clutching the cheap plastic tight against her chest. There were no professional movers in pristine uniforms. There were no expensive leather trunks. The probate court had systematically seized every piece of valuable furniture, every piece of jewelry, and every single physical asset inside that house to begin satisfying the massive commercial debt they owed my estate. They were only allowed to leave with the basic clothing they could carry in their hands. They dragged their garbage bags toward the end of the driveway, where a rusted, beat-up silver sedan was idling. The passenger side door was marred by a massive, ugly dent, and the exhaust pipe sputtered gray smoke into the crisp morning air. The bank had repossessed their matching luxury vehicles 8 days ago. This cheap, heavily used cash car was the absolute best they could manage on such short notice. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of their total ruin. I could see the curtains twitching in the windows of the neighboring mansions. The wealthy socialites Patricia had spent years trying to impress were now actively watching her pack her life into garbage bags under the supervision of armed police officers. It was a spectacular public humiliation. I waited until they were awkwardly shoving the black bags into the cramped trunk of the sedan. Then I signaled my driver. He stepped out and opened my door. The cool morning air hit my face as I stepped onto the pristine asphalt driveway. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit and began walking toward the house. The sharp, rhythmic click of my designer heels echoed like a metronome cutting through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Roland froze. The heavy plastic bag slipped from his grip and hit the pavement with a dull, heavy thud. Patricia spun around, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. The sheer panic radiating from their faces was palpable. They watched me approach, looking like cornered, terrified animals. They were bracing themselves, expecting me to launch into a vicious monologue to gloat over their misery or hurl insults at their defeated figures. They expected a massive, dramatic confrontation because drama was the only language they understood. I did not utter a single word to them. I did not even grant them the dignity of making eye contact. I walked right past their trembling bodies, treating them as if they were entirely invisible. The absolute indifference was a weapon far sharper than any insult I could have thrown. I approached the lead sheriff deputy standing on the porch. I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out the final notarized execution order, and handed him the paperwork. A white commercial van pulled into the driveway behind my SUV, carrying the professional locksmiths I had hired to secure the perimeter. I turned my head slightly, watching the technicians unload their heavy metal toolboxes to change every lock on the property. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Patricia take a step forward. She opened her mouth, taking a desperate, ragged breath as if she was going to beg for forgiveness one last time. But she stopped. The cold, absolute finality in my posture silenced her. The realization washed over her that there was no manipulation left to play, no guilt trip left to trigger, and no daughter left to exploit. I had successfully wiped away the last remaining trace of their toxic grip on my life, and I did it without saying a single word. 2 weeks later, the heavy, humid air of a Georgia evening settled perfectly over the Buckhead estate. I stood alone on the expansive marble balcony of the master suite. My hands rested against the cool stone balustrade. In my right hand, I held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with a 20-year-old aged bourbon. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The liquid burned a smooth, satisfying trail down my throat, settling into a warm knot in my chest. I looked out over the meticulously manicured lawns. The ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss stood like silent sentinels guarding the property. Uncle Desmond had loved this view. He had loved the absolute tranquility of this estate. When I officially took possession, the grounds had been slightly overgrown, a physical reflection of the legal limbo the property had been trapped in. Now the hedges were perfectly clipped, the marble fountains flowed with crystal-clear water, and the massive wrought iron gates at the end of the long driveway remained securely locked against the outside world. The estate was fully restored to its rightful glory. It was a fortress. It was mine. The silence surrounding me was profound. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a hostage situation like the one I had orchestrated in the private dining room of Chop's Lobster Bar. It was the deep, resonant silence of total, absolute victory. The fallout over the past 14 days had been incredibly efficient. My legal team had moved with the lethal precision of a military strike. Following the eviction, my parents had attempted one final, desperate maneuver. Roland, in a pathetic bid for retaliation, had tried to trigger a massive IRS audit on Jasmine Holdings. He had used Trevor's remaining fractured political connections to anonymously tip off federal regulators, hoping to bury me in endless bureaucratic red tape. He wanted to drag me down into the mud right alongside him. It failed spectacularly. The federal agents arrived at my downtown corporate headquarters exactly 10 days ago. They audited our accounts, scrutinized our offshore holdings, and combed through every single real estate acquisition made in the last 5 years. They found absolutely nothing. My ledgers were immaculate. My corporate structures were flawless. The audit cleared with 0 infractions. The lead federal investigator actually shook my hand and apologized for the inconvenience before returning to his vehicle. The best part of Roland's failed sabotage was the immediate ricochet effect. When the federal agents realized the anonymous tip was a completely baseless act of retaliation, they turned their full, unblinking attention back to the source. They marched directly into Trevor's remaining shell companies. Trevor was now facing a mountain of aggressive federal indictments for corporate espionage and wire fraud. His assets were entirely frozen. The SEC fined him into absolute oblivion. Kendra was currently attempting to sell her designer handbags on internet consignment forums just to keep the lights on in a rented townhouse. Meanwhile, my own empire was expanding at a pace that frankly terrified my competitors. Lux Haven Resorts, the crown jewel of my hospitality portfolio, had officially finalized its global expansion initiative that very morning. We broke ground on a massive eco-luxury property in Kyoto and signed the final deeds for a historic boutique hotel in Milan. The board of directors had unanimously voted to increase my managing stake. The wealth was compounding, generating revenue streams that Uncle Desmond had always envisioned, but never lived long enough to see fully realized. I had taken his blueprint and built a skyscraper. I took another slow sip of the bourbon, letting the complex flavors linger on my tongue. I thought about Patricia and Roland. My private security firm had provided a final location report just to ensure the perimeter of my life remained perfectly secure. My biological parents were currently residing in a cheap roadside motel off Interstate 285. They were living out of the black contractor trash bags they had hastily packed on the day of their eviction. Roland was spending his days making frantic, unsuccessful phone calls to former associates who universally refused to answer. Patricia was reportedly drinking cheap boxed wine and terrorizing the motel management over the state of their linens. They had reached out to Kendra begging for financial assistance. Kendra tapped out and, completely bankrupt, screamed at them to lose her number before blocking them both. The toxic unified front they had maintained for decades had shattered under the pressure of actual poverty. They were turning on each other exactly like starving wolves. The toxic weight of my biological family, the heavy, suffocating anchor of their constant demands, their vicious criticisms, and their endless manipulation, was permanently severed. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel the desperate childhood need to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of recognizing it. I felt entirely, undeniably free. I set the crystal tumbler down on the marble railing. The ice clinked softly against the glass. I looked directly out toward the horizon, where the fading purple and gold light of the sunset was giving way to a deep, infinite black. I leaned against the stone, crossing my arms over the expensive fabric of my tailored silk blouse. I let my mind drift back to the very beginning. I thought about the 12-year-old girl standing on the curb with all her worldly possessions shoved into a cheap black plastic hefty bag. I thought about the tears, the confusion, and the soul-crushing agony of being discarded by the people who were supposed to protect her. They thought throwing me away at 12 in a hefty bag would make me a victim. They thought breaking me would keep me small and submissive. They thought I would spend the rest of my life desperate for a crumb of their approval, forever trapped in the shadow of their golden child. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face, reaching all the way to my eyes. The cool evening breeze caught my hair, lifting it gently from my shoulders. They did not realize they were just giving me a 20-year head start on building an empire they could never touch. The greatest lesson we can learn from these toxic family dynamics is that our worth is never defined by those who refuse to see it. When the people who should protect you choose to tear you down, their cruelty is a reflection of their own brokenness, not your value. True strength isn't found in fighting for a seat at a table where you are disrespected. It is found in the absolute courage to walk away and silently build your own empire. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace, we want to hear from you. Share your own story of triumph in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering journeys.